How many of you have been hearing stories in the media about how LSD, psilocybin, and other hallucinogens may offer some breakthroughs in the treatment of mental illness? Looks like most of us. Yeah, it's really a hot topic now, and we happen to have as our speaker an expert in this field who will enlighten us, Dr. Jim Grigsby. He's a neuropsychologist and professor at the University of Colorado in Denver in the departments of psychology and in the Department of Medicine in the Division of Healthcare Policy and Research. His research and study has been really wide-ranging. I wish I had time to tell you more about it, but in health services and in cognitive neurosciences where he made his major contributions. And for the last 5 years, I've had the privilege of working with him on an NIH-funded clinical trial of telemedicine where he's the principal investigator. But related to today's presentation, Jim was a co-investigator on a Boulder-based clinical trial using MDMA, most of you may know it as the ecstasy, as it's commonly known, for the treatment of treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder. And the results of this study are, you're going to hear more about, but has just been recently accepted for publication in Psychopharmacology Journal. He's currently also editing with Charlie Grove, who's a professor of psychiatry at UCLA, the Handbook of Medical Uses of Hallucinogens, which will be published early next year. Please help me give a warm Rotary welcome to my friend and colleague, Jim Grigsby.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you for having me here today. I'm pleased to be able to talk with you about some of the new research that's going on in a field that for a long time I think most of us thought was dead. It's been 50 years roughly since much work was done in the area of psychedelics, but there's quite a bit that's going on now. So what I'm going to try to do is give you just a quick overview of some of the history and talk about some of the directions that the field is headed right now. These are some of the major psychedelics. For a long time, the first four were the primary ones that were around: LSD, psilocybin, which is in mushrooms, mescaline, which comes from the peyote cactus, and another cactus called San Pedro. And then there's a, let's see if this thing, yeah, I don't know.
What is the computer over here, Jim?
Trying to get the laser thing to point. Anyway, DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is one of these psychedelics. More recently, there's been a lot of attention to ayahuasca. There's a article, I think, in the New Yorker about 6 or 8 months ago that talked about it. It's kind of becoming faddish, its use, a lot of places around the country. MDMA, and then I'll talk a bit about ketamine too. So you wouldn't realize that with all the recent attention, these psychedelics are all pretty old. They've been around for quite some time. It's estimated that there are 200 to 300 new psychedelics that have been synthesized over the years. One chemist in particular, a guy named Alexander Shulgin, did a lot of that work. But I'm going to talk about these because these are the ones that are the best studied. So this is a picture of Albert Hofmann. He's a Swiss chemist. He worked for Sandoz Pharmaceutical, and in 1938, he synthesized LSD. And they were looking for something at the time that Sandoz was for something that might be able to play a role in clotting. And there was also some thought that LSD might be able to have some possible application with induction of labor and childbirth. But they synthesized this thing and really didn't find anything very remarkable in their animal studies, so they put it aside. About 5 years later, Hoffman just had this funny feeling about LSD. He thought there might be something there, so he whipped up a batch in his lab and inadvertently absorbed some through his skin and felt strange and went home. In fact, he went home on his bicycle, and in Switzerland they began celebrating what they call Bicycle Day, which I think is April 19th every year. That was the day on which Hoffman discovered this. He apparently had quite a bike ride home. But he, the next day or within a couple of days, decided to try what he thought would be a tiny dose. And he took what in fact turns out to be a moderately large dose, because this stuff is so powerful, it doesn't take very much. And LSD was kind of off to the races from that point on. A lot of research done in the field. In fact, over 1,000 papers, scientific papers published on this by 1970. So a whole lot of work was done that most people don't know much about. Hoffman also was the first person to identify the ingredient in magic mushrooms. A guy named Gordon Wasson, I think he was an ethnobotanist. He had worked with mushrooms, and Hoffman and Sandoz took an interest in it, and he determined that psilocybin is the active ingredient. And in fact, what happens is people take psilocybin and it changes into a compound called psilocin, which then has an effect that's very similar to that of LSD. That was in the 50s that work was done. This particular compound, the name is a mouthful. That's why they just call it Mdma. And basically what it is, it's what they would call a substituted amphetamine. So it's an amphetamine-like drug, a stimulant, but it's got some groups attached to it that give it an effect that's not quite psychedelic, but very close to it. First synthesized by Merck in 1912. They had the patent on it, and the guy that I mentioned, Shulgin, Alexander Shulgin, he sort of rediscovered this fairly recently in the 70s. And it's interesting because MDMA came along just as the whole war on drugs was gearing up, and MDMA was around for a number of years. Psychiatrists found it and began to use it with a number of kinds of conditions and thought that it was quite helpful. But then in the mid-'80s, it was taken off the market too. Let's see here. I'm going to move this slightly so I don't fall off the stage. So the real work with hallucinogens, as they're often called, or psychedelics, began in the 1950s. And one of the first things that was done in all places was in Saskatchewan, so one of the prairie provinces of Canada, almost directly north of here. And it was used to treat people who had problems with alcohol. There was a hospital in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, a provincial hospital, kind of like our state hospitals here. And a good deal of research was done at that time. Around then, too, it was used in some other places that you wouldn't necessarily have expected. There's a U.S. Public Health Service hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, where quite a bit of work was done with LSD for a number of years, again with alcoholism. And the Topeka VA hospital until probably the late 70s did some research with LSD as well. One of the interesting things people don't realize is that the guy who founded Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the co-founders, Bill Wilson, he's often referred to as Bill W., He stumbled across LSD in the 50s, and he decided that, in fact, it should play an important role in AA, but by that time he was no longer in control of the organization, and people who were thought that was a very bad idea, because here you had people who had problems with drugs, and you didn't want to use another one to get them off of it. So that never went anywhere, but Wilson apparently thought that this was what had really been missing from AA. Other work in the late 50s, early 60s dealt with the quality of life of people who were dying, generally of cancer. Study done in Chicago by a physician named Eric Cast found that people with end-stage cancer had their pain relieved better with LSD than with opioids. And pain medication doses were reduced for a lot of people very significantly, by 75% in some cases. Aldous Huxley, his wife gave him LSD as he was dying. So he was a person who was taking seriously some of the work done with psychedelics in palliative care. And then it was also used as an adjunct to standard psychotherapy. There were people in the, well, I guess it wasn't the UK at the time, but in England and Germany, as well as in Los Angeles, some people in New York as well, who were doing research on this. And one of the more famous of the people who went through this kind of treatment was Cary Grant. I don't recall exactly, but I believe he had something like 75 LSD sessions administered by his psychiatrist in connection with kind of a long-term psychotherapy that he was involved in. But things turned bad. The counterculture was really promoting the use of LSD, and probably there's blame that could be pointed in a lot of directions. A lot of people say Tim Leary went wild and caused problems, but Richard Nixon found himself in political trouble, and he identified his main tormentors as the war protesters and blacks. He felt that the civil rights movement had it in for him. And so it's interesting, just fairly recently, John Ehrlichman, one of his top advisors, made this statement. He said that Nixon very explicitly decided to begin this war on drugs, focusing on psychedelics and marijuana, because what he wanted to do was to go after the black civil rights people as well as counterculture people, so that he could shut that down. So what happened was these things became what are called Schedule I substances. Schedule I means they have no accepted medical use, and they are prone to be abused. And so, you know, the penalties became quite severe. There are reportedly still people in Texas who are serving essentially life sentences for simple possession of marijuana, because the country swung so far to the other side. So not much happened for a long time. Some psychiatrists tended to use this underground into the 80s, MDMA in particular, but there's been a sort of a rebirth of interest in psychedelics starting in around the mid-80s, and some studies began in the 1990s. The first two places were at the University of New Mexico. A guy named Rick Strassman was given money by the National Institute of Mental Health to look at DMT. And then at UCLA, my co-editor on this book that Gary mentioned, Charlie Grobe, Charlie got a grant from NIH to look at people who were dying and see if it could improve quality of life. Currently, there are large psychedelic research programs underway at Johns Hopkins Hospital. I think they have 7 different studies in the works right now. New York University, UCLA, There's work being done at University of Wisconsin, a lot of other places. University of Colorado, there is some medical marijuana research underway, but I've run into a number of faculty members in the medical school who are quite interested in this and are beginning to put together applications to get grants to fund this kind of research. Most studies today use either psilocybin or MDMA. LSD isn't used as much, even though most of the researchers feel that it is equally or even possibly more effective as psilocybin, but it doesn't have a lot of the political baggage that LSD does. Psilocybin is not quite as strong as LSD. It doesn't last quite as long. LSD has effects that last for 6.5 to 8 or 9 hours for some people. Psilocybin is more like 4.5 to 6 hours, and it's a bit gentler, but both have proven really very effective for a number of different, I guess you could say, conditions. Alcohol and addictions is one of the areas that still is drawing a whole lot of attention, and there are actually some other kinds of drugs out there that are being used for this as well. There's a thing called ibogaine. It's from the root of the iboga tree, which is, I believe, an African tree that's used to treat addictions, and it seems like it's quite helpful. There are reports that it's effective in anywhere between 70 and 85% of people who are treated with addictions. It's pretty interesting. One area that's been studied at Hopkins is smoking cessation, and some preliminary research that they've done there found that with people who are long-term smokers, I think the average person in the study had been smoking at least a pack a day for 30 years, and the average person in the study had tried to quit, made a real effort to quit at least 6 times. What they found in this study at Hopkins was that 6 months out of a program which included 1 or 2 psilocybin sessions, about 80% of the people who participated were not smoking. They carried that on out further, looked at a follow-up at 1 year, and then an average of about 16 months afterward. And the percentage dropped a bit. It was about 67%. But that was pretty impressive, because if you look at most smoking cessation programs at 6 months out, they are less than 15% effective. Anywhere from 5 to 14% is where most studies range. So psilocybin is at least 5 times as effective if you think in terms of the number of people who are able to remain abstinent after a long period. And it's interesting too, because a lot of people who have been through that program say they just have no interest in it at all, which is kind of striking, because I know people who did smoke and quit, and maybe they haven't smoked for 30 years, but they'll often say, oh yeah, I liked it, and I still dream about it, and I'll wake up in the middle of the night and think, boy, I'd sure like to have a cigarette. But people who've had this approach to treatment say, nah, they're just not interested. Palliative care is an area that is really very striking too. A lot of people who are facing death, they have difficulty with anxiety, with depression. They're very afraid of what's going to happen when they die. They're struggling a lot of times with pain and debility that may be associated with their diseases. And Hopkins, NYU, and UCLA have all done recent studies looking at palliative care, and they've found that a very high percentage of the people that they treat have striking reductions in depression and anxiety. Their concerns about death are diminished. And when I say large numbers, it runs about 75 to 90% of people having experiences that they consider very important. In fact, Hopkins has done follow-up research on in a couple of different populations. One is with people who were terminally ill, another is with just general public, people who were naive to psychedelics, hadn't taken any before, but were interested in seeing what it was like. And what they tried to do at Hopkins was to induce what they've described as a mystical experience. They haven't tried to define that in any particular way because it looks like people experience that differently. But something like 75% of the people who participate experience something like that. And when they follow these people up, a very high percentage of people who've experienced that mystical experience, something like 90% say that it's either the most profound or one of the most profound experiences of their lives. And so you see striking changes not only in their psychological functioning, their anxiety, their depression, but also in their caregivers. It's often easier for spouses of people who've been taking care of really sick people. Depression just generally is an area that's real open to treatment, it seems, with psychedelics. It was quite an advance a number of years ago when drugs like Prozac came along, sort of the second generation of antidepressants, and they've been very effective, but people pretty much have to take those for the rest of their lives. So there are other treatments coming up. Some of them are non-pharmacological. Some use what they call TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, placing magnets at different places around the head. And what you basically can do is induce changes in electrical fields in the brain. And it looks like that's pretty effective, but what's really pretty striking is that psilocybin in a high percentage of people who are treated for depression, something around 70%, is quite effective. And when people have been treated using this approach, they don't need to take Prozac. Typically, there's a real amelioration of their symptoms, and that can last for quite a while. Another one of the drugs that I listed up there at the start is ketamine. Ketamine is actually what they call a dissociative anesthetic. So if you've ever had nitrous oxide at the dentist's office, or I don't know, I think of it as somewhat like when I have my colonoscopy and they give me this cocktail of Versed and fentanyl. And I'm kind of there and I'm kind of not. I'm just really sort of suspended someplace. That's a bit what ketamine is like, although it often has a kind of a psychedelic quality for a lot of people. But it's been found to be pretty effective for treating depression also. I guess I got into it here. Yeah, it's used in a number of different ways. Intravenously and intramuscularly are very common, but once people have been treated like that, they often are prescribed these little lozenges, and they can be at home, and if there's someone around, they can keep an eye on them. That's good. Sometimes they'll do this back in their physician's office, but a couple of these lozenges, or even a nasal spray, it's less intense, doesn't last quite as long as the IM or the intravenous administration, but still looks like it's pretty effective. And there's a psychiatrist that I've worked with who's up in Fort Collins that uses this with people who have failed in other antidepressant treatment. So Prozac didn't help them, Paxil, a lot of these SSRIs, and he says that he thinks as many as 80% of those people respond to ketamine. I worked on a study, Gary mentioned, it was in Boulder. We finished it up about 2.5 years ago, something like that. Just publishing the results of it. We treated 28 people who had severe treatment-resistant PTSD from a variety of things. One of the guys I treated had been a vet. He was over in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and had not had a good night's sleep in the 6 years since he'd been discharged from the military. You know, a lot of the women in the study had been raped. There was physical assault, a number of kind of serious traumatic incidents. And what we found is that everyone in the study showed some improvement. And by the time people had had 3 sessions with MDMA and some associated therapy sessions, 75% no longer met any of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. And that's really pretty striking when you consider the fact that, for example, one of these patients was a woman who was raped when she was 15, got into the study at the age of 31, and in that 16-year period, estimated she'd had over 1,000 psychotherapy sessions, 3 inpatient hospitalizations, and had been on a wide range of psychiatric meds. It's something that doesn't need to be repeated either. People are reluctant to use the word cure, so we're not saying that it is a cure, but it's something that looks a whole lot like a cure. Because the symptoms don't appear to come back. So these are some of the symptoms of PTSD, and the people that we saw pretty much had most or all of these, re-experiencing the event, avoidance, hyperarousal. That was one of this veteran's real problems. That's why he couldn't sleep. He's constantly vigilant. Got to be watchful all the time. He was a sniper and had to be constantly alert. And then people feel mood. You know, one of the things that happens with combat vets that's really difficult to treat is what they call moral injury. It's different than standard post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not necessarily in response to a terrible traumatic event. It has more to do with the fact that in combat, your senses are totally alive. You're fully awake. And people will say that they have never felt as alive or alert in their lives. And it feels good. It's kind of like being in the zone in sports. You feel like you can do just about anything. But what they're doing is killing people. And so it's a bizarre experience because they're feeling more alive and more real than they ever have, enjoying themselves, shooting people. And it produces what they call a moral injury. A lot of people say, yeah, they feel like a monster. They feel really bad about the fact that they felt so good when they were doing that. So it appears that MDMA is very helpful in treating that. And it's a big problem. About 8% of the U.S. population excuse me, is thought to be going to develop PTSD at some point in their lifetime. It's a higher percentage of women than men. The reasons for that aren't clear, but interestingly, the immune system appears to play a role in development of PTSD, and men's and women's immune systems are somewhat different. The prevalence, so that's the number of people who have it at any given time, it's difficult to estimate, but it's thought to be between 3 and 8%. It's really disabling, and it's very costly. I worked at the VA hospital for about 8 years at one point and saw a lot of Vietnam veterans with PTSD. You know, if they are given what's called 100% service-connected disability, they're making, I'm not sure, I think it's around $3,500 a month now, something like that, and they're going to get that for the rest of their lives. And they don't get that unless it is such a problem that they really can't work anymore. So it's extremely costly, billions of dollars a year. And people who have PTSD are also more likely to use other health services. So if we had an effective treatment for it, and these drugs seem to be good candidates for that, we might be able to cut a lot of healthcare expenses. Just a little bit more about this MDMA and trauma. The main person who's been involved in this is a psychiatrist and ER doc named Michael Mithofer, who's in Charleston, South Carolina. He's done a couple studies now with very similar findings to ours. His most recent study looked at firefighters, combat veterans, and police officers, all of whom are often really at risk for PTSD. And he found that 3 sessions, like in our study in Boulder, 3 sessions with MDMA along with preparatory and follow-up sessions really led to very significant improvements. So I think
Jim, I'm sorry, we're going to have to wrap up.
Yeah, I was just going to say I just
maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Sure. Yeah.
Traditional psychotherapy methods have used everything from systematic desensitization to EMDR work. Has there been any comparative analysis between those types of traditional psychotherapeutic modalities and what you're doing with the MDMA research?
No direct comparisons so far as such. What we have done is there are a couple studies that are trying to look at care as usual, but they don't define a particular condition. But the people who are in these studies, for the most part, had been through most of those without a lot of benefit. So we think it'd be really important to compare them head to head and see if there really is a big difference.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to have to stop and move on, but Jim, thank you so much. That was really interesting. And as a child in Boulder in the 60s and 70s, everything that's old is new again. So thank you so much. And in your honor, the Boulder Rotary Club is pleased to contribute 100 doses of polio vaccine to the Polio Plus Fund.